So my background's in the Air Force. I started once I graduated the Air Force Academy in 2012. I started out as a combat rescue officer, and my job was obviously working in personnel recovery and working with small teams, kind of geographically separated, and doing some really fun things. We were jumping out of planes, riding in helicopters, doing all the things that you associate with military special operations. And it's a really good group of guys to be a part of.
Welcome to the Uptime Podcast. I am your co-host, Alan Hall, here with Rosemary Barnes and Joel Saxum. And we have a really packed show today. We were talking about the Siemens Gamesa recyclable blade that's going to be put out in the ocean off the coast of Germany coming up this summer. The Biden-Harris administration is proposing offshore leases offshore for California. And then we have a really interesting guest, Will Friedl, CEO of Prometheus Wind, will be here. And he's going to be talking about tensioning and torquing of bolts, like tower bolts, that are super important.
And then after the interview, we're going to talk a bit about the Australian election that we recently had, a change of government, and I explain a little bit about some of the unique features of the Australian electoral system, and so how it led to that result. And then we talk about ESG ratings and how it can be that a green sort of company like Tesla can get kicked out of the S&P ESG 500, whereas a fossil fuel company like ExxonMobil can remain within it.
Guys, Siemens Gamesa says they're producing the first recyclable blade, and they're actually going to deploy it offshore. Now, their factory in Hull in the UK, which is a big factory for Siemens Gamesa in terms of blades, is the one producing this, and they're using that recycled blades technology. And when the blade is finished, it's going out to RWE's installation in Kaskasi offshore wind farm, Kaskasi.
Yeah.
Kaskasi? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's missing a consonant somewhere in there. So it's in the German North Sea. It's going out there this summer, Rosemary. So like it's soon, right? The resin system is created by, here's another name I'm going to murder, Adita Berla Advanced Materials. So they created this resin system a while ago, evidently. And if you go onto the website like I did, you can actually see some pretty cool description of what it is. But it does. It's what Rosemary has talked about and explained to us before, Joel, which is you can get a thermoset and it sort of interlinks together, and then you can magically throw some chemical at it and it unlinks, and she can break the components apart again. So that's the technology. So this wind farm where this blade is going to be is a 342 megawatt wind farm, which will have 38 Siemens Gamesa wind turbines with a output of up to 9 megawatts. That doesn't sound right. It sounds like there must be 9 megawatt turbines. That doesn't sound right either, but maybe it is. So this site has a couple of other innovations, which I think are interesting. They're using collared monopiles for the turbines out in the ocean, and they're using a vibrating pile driving system. So instead of dropping the massive weight on top and sort of hammering the piling down into the seafloor, they're actually sort of vibrating it down, which is another technique. So it's sort of like this collective of different ideas that RWE is going to be involved with and Siemens Gamesa is going to be involved with. So it's not just the blade, recyclable blade, but there's a lot of other new technology going in one place. Question is, do you think Siemens Gamesa really has this figured out enough to actually deploy a recyclable blade in the field?
So, Alan, maybe you saw some different information to me, because from what I have read, it's very vague about the resin being used and the recycling process. Did you say that you saw it was a thermoset or a thermoplastic?
Okay, it said it was both.
Both.
Okay, so if you go onto the manufacturer's website, it says it's a thermoset that also can be made into a thermoplastic. And I don't know if that means the two individual components are thermoplastic and then it turns into a thermoset the way they're doing it. But it read like it works like a thermoset, but it was actually a thermoplastic. So there was some sort of transformation happening in the middle of that.
Okay.
Does that make any sense? Because that's what the website said.
It doesn't currently make sense to me, but it could be that I don't fully understand it, because I just found like a sales brochure that is very, very vague in its wording. Just talks about why we need to recycle blades a lot, and that's understood. And then it says the recycling process is that they will immerse the blade into a mild acidic solution, a heated mild acidic solution, which will separate the resin from the fiberglass, plastic, wooden materials. Now, I'm imagining that they are not going to be, the resin is going to be dissolved in this heated mild acidic solution, right? So the resin itself doesn't sound like it's going to be recycled, that it's about recycling the fibers and all the other stuff in there, is my guess, which would maybe explain why they're a little bit further ahead than some of their competitors, because everyone's trying pretty hard to make a recyclable blade, and until now the most exciting progress was this LM blade, where they just made a one-off blade and are now doing testing with it, whereas Siemens Gamesa said that they've already made 6 blades, and they're going to install a couple of demo turbines actually offshore. So that puts them a fair bit further along if they already understand this material well enough to be installing it on turbines. That surprises me how close they are, how ready they are to that, because usually it's a long process to qualify. It's not just a new resin, it's a new type of resin if you want to make it fully recyclable, or change from a thermoset to a thermoplastic. So it kind of implies that it's a smaller change. It would be really interesting to talk to an engineer involved in this, and not the communications department's take on it.
Well, I wonder if they're talking, because when I went to their website, the manufacturer's website, they're not using it just for wind turbines. They had other industries that were using this same sort of resin system. Why would it be just limited to wind turbines? It should be almost all thermosets, in theory, could use this recyclable resin system.
Yeah.
Does it reference anything besides resin? Does it reference any of the gel coat or any of the fiberglass inlay? Is it synthetic glass? Or there's a boat manufacturer out there right now that's doing using glass or flaxseed or
green boats.
Green boats for their
had them on the podcast.
But does it
really
mention
cool.
anything like that besides the resin? Is it, or is
no,
it just?
it explicitly says the only difference is the resin.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that the challenge is going to be then, it's not 100% new. We have been able to dissolve resin away from composite fibers for a while. And even, natural materials like flax, that's not new in the composites world. It's just, usually economics that's preventing that. But the challenge with dissolving the resin away from the fibers is then, what do you do with these fibers? Because the strength and all of the amazing properties of composite materials come from these long fibers, and they're they're thin enough that they contain no flaws in them. So glass is usually a very brittle material, but if you make it in a very, very thin fiber, there's no space for an air bubble or a crack or something, and so you get these really amazing properties. But you need the long fibers to actually take advantage of that. If you have in your recycling process, if you end up damaging the fibers and shortening them, then you're really downgrading the structural properties of that. So it's really interesting to make a recyclable blade, but it's also very fuzzy what recyclable means, because you can already take a wind turbine blade and shred it and turn it into material to make a deck out of, or a car dashboard out of, or some low structural requirements application that already exists. So what I want to know is, what are they going to be able to do with these fibers after they recycle them? And that's the interesting point.
Well, they can make it into a nacelle, right? The nacelles are usually made out of chopped fiber, at least the ones I've been around. So you could actually take the blade, take the fiber, chop it, and then cast yourself a nacelle, or make a surfboard, or whatever else you wanted to do with it. But at least you have the ability to recycle that component. And it sounds like they want to reuse the resin. Like they want to split it apart, put it back in the barrels, and then build something else with it. And probably, Yeah, well, you could use it for a nacelle. Maybe you could. And those are epoxy resin systems of some sort, so they could reuse
It
it
doesn't
there.
sound like they'll be
Does that
able
make
to
sense?
though, with this one. If they're dissolving it into an acid bath, then how are you going to re-get that resin out of the solution again? I think that there's some advance that's been made here, but I think that if you read between the lines, a lot of it is maybe creative marketing of the term recyclable. It might not mean what you kind of interpret it to mean. But if they are able to take the glass fiber or carbon fiber and turn it into something as useful as a nacelle or a surfboard, then that will be a step up from where we are today. So at the moment, usually you're shredding it so small that you wouldn't be able to do something like that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to get more details.
If I can get Adita Burla on the podcast, if I could get Adita Burla on the podcast, would you talk to them? Like if I could twist some arms there and convince them to come on?
I'll grill anybody on this topic and see what they'll tell me.
Okay, I think it's a fair trade. Let's see if we can make that happen, because everybody wants to know what this recycling material is and how it breaks down. I think, and you're right. I think your question about the epoxy, how it breaks down with this. I've heard the acid described as something equivalent to lemon juice. It's not lemon juice, but something similar to break this epoxy apart. I think we all want to hear what that is. Next topic, Biden and Harris administration proposes first ever California offshore wind lease sale. And as we talked to Kevin Ewing a few months back about the leases on the East Coast, it's a long, involved process, but they're talking about really two separate areas from what I can tell, sort of like Central California and Northern California. They're not really discussing Southern California, which is probably one of the more major energy users in the country. But they're opening up a couple of sites that in theory would be about 4.5 gigawatts of wind, which is pretty massive, actually. That's a lot of wind turbines. They're thinking that there's going to be this lease process like there was on the East Coast for Byte and a couple others, which generated $4 billion. So I'm guessing that California, and the federal government in particular, is going to be making orders of magnitude more than that off of these leases. But a couple of things about these leases which are I think are unique to me. First, obviously, Joel, they're going to be floating wind turbines. That's the first thing, because
coast of California is much like the coast of Norway, right? There's not a whole lot of offshore wind along the coast of Norway because it just gets deep too quick. So you're going to have the same thing out in the California side.
So the federal government is giving credits, and this is interesting because it's sort of a loaded system on the bidding. You get a 2.5% bidding credit for bidders who have executed or commit to executing a community benefit agreement with the community or ocean users. Who's an ocean user besides the fisheries?
Right.
Who are going to use that area? So if you work with the local fisheries over there, the community, you're going to get 2.5% credit. You can get a 20% bidding credit if you commit to invest in programs that will advance U.S. offshore wind energy workforce training, supply chain development, or both. That's 20% is huge.
Massive.
Right?
Massive, right?
So who's not going to do that, right? I mean, that's going to decide the winners and the losers right there. And the requirement that the lessees make every reasonable effort to enter into a project labor agreement covering the construction of the project. This basically means, I think, is that coded words for, Joel, you can tell me, is that coded words for connecting with a union to install the turbines? Is that what that means?
I would say absolutely, yeah.
And then
go ahead.
It just seems a little odd otherwise. And the last one is requirements for the lessees to engage with tribes, underserved communities, ocean users, and agencies. Lessees will be required to report on their engagement and make reasonable efforts to implement their projects in a manner that minimizes and mitigates their project's adverse effects, if any, on these parties. So it sounds like you have to have a community get together to decide if your wind turbine project off the coast of California is going to affect anybody. I don't know how you come to an agreement there, but it's a requirement. So there's a lot of things, and just besides we're going to put some turbines out in the water out here, and I'm going to pay you a couple $2 billion for that spot. I've also had some obligations to work with the local community, work with unions, and not be a nuisance. I think that's what they're saying. So is this auction going to be as massive as the one on the East Coast? I think that's the question.
Well, I think so to your points are the 2.5% bidding credit for the community benefit and the 20% for bidders who commit to invest. I think those are very solid metric-based things. The next points where they say, right. Well, you have to do your best efforts to do this. That's kind of wishy-washy, and I'm not sure how much that will fly. But yeah, you're going to see the same things on the West Coast as you did on the East Coast. Involvement with the unions, so they can bring in some high-paying jobs. Totally understood. But I think the difference here between the two is, the whole world right now is looking at floating wind. How do we do it efficiently? What are the best models? What are the best ways to do it? Do we do a spar? Do we do this? There's all kinds of different designs out there. The East Coast, when they did all the auctions there, that's existing technology. Your monopiles or jackets, you're out in, 20 to 65, 80 meters of water. That can be done right now. So there's not as much risk to that auction, and that $1 billion or whatever we saw go for the New York Bight, that was very high. But I don't know if you'll see that level of involvement in the California one for two reasons in my head. One reason, it's all floating, right? So the technology isn't quite there, where it's not mature. We don't know exactly what the best way to do that is. And the second one, all of these companies just spent a pile of money on the East Coast. So
right, they did.
Yeah,
true.
So there might be, and you saw the auction that was just in the Carolinas didn't fetch as high a prices as the auction up in the northern part of the East Coast. So while I'm happy to see this happen, the regulatory climate off the California coast, I think, is going to be a little bit more intense than some of the stuff you'll see on the East Coast. So is it going to be the same kind of timeline that you see the developments going from auction to first energy coming to shore? I think it'll be longer over there. I could honestly think that, in my mind, the California lease sales might go first, but I could see wind in the Gulf before that, just because of the regulatory environment and technology.
Ping Monitor is a continuous blade monitoring system which allows wind farm operators to stay ahead of maintenance. Wind techs can often hear damaged blades from the ground, but they can't continuously monitor all the turbines. They also can't calculate how bad the damage is or how fast it's propagating based on sound, but Ping can. Ping's acoustic system is being used on over 600 turbines worldwide. It allows operators to discover damage before it gets expensive and prioritize maintenance needs across their fleet, and it pays for itself the first time it identifies serious damage or saves you from doing an unnecessary visual inspection. Stop flying blind out there. Get Ping's ears on your turbines. Learn more at pingmonitor.co.
I have with me today Will Friedl, who is the CEO of Prometheus Wind based in Monument, Colorado. Welcome to the program, Will.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, so there's a lot to discuss today, and you're in a unique situation because Prometheus is a small business. You're getting into wind, and you're similar to our company, actually, in terms of probably size. So we can kind of go back and forth about the different things that are happening on the small business end of being in wind and some of the difficulties, and also want to learn some of the things you guys do in regards to tensioning and torquing of bolts, which is something I don't know anything about. So I want to have a little dialogue there. So what got you started in wind energy, and what made you want to start a business?
So my background's in the Air Force. I started, once I graduated the Air Force Academy in 2012, I started out as a combat rescue officer. And my job was obviously working in personnel recovery and working with small teams, kind of geographically separated, and doing some really fun things. We were jumping out of planes, riding in helicopters, doing all the things that you associate with military special operations. And it's a really good group of guys to be a part of. And more recently, when I decided that I was going to get out of the military, I took away the thing that I got out from the military through that whole experience is that I realized that the things that were really fun about the military were great. They really provided a lot of value. But what I wanted in the next job and the next step of my life was to have a really strong connection between how I was spending my time and what I was doing and what was valuable to me, And so I was willing to do something that's not quite as fun, but probably a little bit more purposeful. So working in the wind industry, our mission set is really to kind of save the ecology of the earth, and that's something that's like, you can't really get, that's another like really awesome mission set that's very motivational. And it's not, the only issue is that it's kind of ethereal. It's not like, you do a lot of activity. You don't like look at your watch and be like, oh, nice, that's a half degree saved right there. And so it's like really hard to grasp onto. So what actually is what I find the most motivational and what I have the strongest connection with is very similarly to the military. The wind industry has a lot of young adults who are coming into it, and they're pouring their lives into this industry. They go out, especially the traveling technicians, anybody working construction, they go to these sites and they'll work there, 60, 70 hours a week. They don't have a whole lot of other things going on, and it kind of becomes this, consuming environment for them. And if you set it up well, like there's a lot of opportunity to create mentorship and growth in these individuals, and really take them, through the struggles of that everybody deals with, going through life. And you can give them lessons learned. You can give them tools that they'll use for the rest of their life. They'll get out of wind eventually, especially if they're traveling. A lot of guys, they've only got 5 or 6 years in them as travelers, and then they go and they transition to a different stage of their life. But the things and the lessons that they learned and the mentorship that they get, they'll be able to use that forever, and then hopefully maybe even pass it on to their kids. And so it's that environment that everybody's working towards this goal, very putting a lot of effort into it, and that creates a sense of camaraderie.
It's all working for a purpose. Right, it's all working towards a purpose.
Yeah, it's all working towards a purpose, and you've got the purpose of the work that you're doing, and then you've got the growth that comes from the experience of having that purpose. So
yeah, you're right. I think wind is challenging. It's got to be somewhat like being in the military service. Is that you're kind of out on your own a lot of the time, and the work you have is challenging in front of you, and you're it. It isn't like you have 50 people standing there willing to help you. You're out there with the 2-3 people working on wind turbines, trying to figure out how to make this thing go. It takes a lot of intestinal fortitude and a lot of knowledge of what you should be doing. So it's challenging. That's good, right? That's good. Which I guess leads you into why you want to start a small business, because you've already had the challenge of being in the Air Force, which is challenging enough, and now you want to transition over to starting a wind business. What are some of those challenges that you have just starting up and getting that business going?
It's a little bit non-standard, I would say. My challenges are kind of different because of the Air Force's background. The Air Force almost does itself a disservice in that it really invests a lot of people in its invests a lot of energy in developing its people, and specifically the leaders. And so, you go through all of these different experiences in order to gain these capabilities. And at the end, you're like, man, I could do anything. And then they're like, all right, your contract's up. You want to stay? And I was like, so my last experience, for instance, I was working at the Air Force Academy, and my job was to run summer programs. And so essentially, we would work all through the school year. It was just me and a small team, and we would develop the different training operations that would happen in the summer. And then, in the springtime when, school finished, we would take 600 people. So we'd take 400 students, 200 permanent party, and we would train them up on this new job that they would do that's not something that they do in their day to day. And then, once they were ready, we would bring in 1,000 students, and we would run this 1,600 person operation through the summer, doing all the same stuff that you do in an organization, controlling for quality, controlling for safety, managing HR, all the different things, the activities. It was my team's responsibility to design the systems that did that, And so, having gone through such a large scale, essentially entrepreneurship experience, I realized that I really had a passion for it. I really enjoyed it. I really got to see the fruits of the design. And even though it took a long time to get there, once everything came together, it was really just an amazing experience. And so, so when it comes to the question, come back to the question, you're like, what's the challenges that I've run into? It's not the systemizing. It's not learning how to delegate. It's not the things that, you hear from a lot of different entrepreneurs. For me, the biggest challenge by far is getting access to decision makers and understanding their perspectives and being able to, communicate value to them, because I have zero connections in the wind industry. We started off and I was like, all right, let me check LinkedIn to see, who do I know in this industry? And there was nobody. There was one person, who's a site leader for a company that there's no way that we can, as a startup, become a customer for, and he gave me a little bit, but that was it, so it's like starting from ground zero, trying to figure this out. My brothers have lots of experience and they have lots of contacts in the industry, but all of their contacts are mainly at the technician level. So we know a lot of people who are really good at getting a lot of work done, but we don't know the decision makers. We don't know the project managers. We don't know the program managers. We don't know the executives. And so, like, trying to get to the people and be able to communicate the value that we have, and in a way that allows them to take the financial leap of faith in order to test us out, just has been something that we've been working on for a long time.
So what are some of the ways that you're reaching out right now to connect with some of those procurement people and the engineers that are running around trying to keep all these wind turbines running? They're really busy people. How are you trying to connect with everybody?
It's networking by force, I guess, so like going to as many, I'm not an extrovert, I'm not like one of those natural connectors. And so it's been a challenge for me, but it's been something obviously that I've needed to do, my brothers and I, all of us. And so we've gone to networking events, the conferences, especially once COVID ended. We're like, all right, let's take advantage of all these things, so OMS back in, so we did OMS back in March. Before that, we did ACP. We went to the Blades. We've been to the Blades conference, for our blade repair department, and then we're going to have a presence in the ACP that's coming up in what is that, 2 weeks from now?
Oh, San Antonio.
So we're doing that. We've done a little bit of LinkedIn. I'm not a social media guy myself, but we've built a presence on LinkedIn, and then we've done a lot of sales trips, knocking on doors and just, telling people, hey, this is what we're about. Do you think this is a service that's valuable to you? And then going to the next place and seeing what we can drum up from there. But it seems like you got to tell the whole world.
That's a good way to do it.
When you're a small business, you got to sift through like a lot of people in order to find those early adopters, because they're definitely few and far between, it seems.
Yeah, and I think the hardest part in wind is everybody's so busy that it's hard to meet up with people because they are so active right now that getting someone's attention for just a couple of minutes is really hard. And you're right. I think going to those conferences is probably the right place, because it's probably the only time where a lot of the technicians and staff and engineers get a time to slightly decompress, where they know they're going to be somewhere without the phone ringing every 5 minutes. It's probably the place to be. So that's good. I think you're doing the right thing. Yeah. So your company has done a lot with tensioning of bolts or retensioning of bolts, sort of the checks that happen there. And I that's a fascinating area for me, because it's something that I'm not familiar with at all. But I know, watching the industry, there's a lot of effort into making sure the bolts are tight and that they remain tight. And we had seen issues with that more recently with tower bolts that have come loose, or they've had been some sort of upset, or the vibration where it's caused damage. So what are some of those issues about bolt tensioning or retensioning that you see out there in the field? And why would a bolt as massive as some of these bolts are ever come loose?
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. On one site that my brother was at, they when they were doing the construction operations, they were torquing the bolts and they got the wrong torque specs. So they over torqued all of these different bolts, and so they had to come back through and sweep, and if you leave a bolt over torqued too much, it has the potential to just snap clean in half. So obviously that's something that's a huge, failure mode there. Then you got just the vibration. These things are swaying back and forth. They're moving with the wind, and just that movement, the vibration of the machinery can allow that bolt to loosen up. You can have the material degradation where it just doesn't have it's been stretched, but that stretch doesn't maintain the 100% of the tension over time. Specifically for the base bolts, you can have the grout start to degrade. You can have those bolts move a little bit. So there's all kinds of things that can happen over time that kind of require you to check the bolts just to make sure that they're operating within the safe capacity.
Yeah, when we talked a couple of weeks ago, I decided actually to look up on YouTube, like, what does bolt tension even look like? I didn't realize it's a complicated procedure. There's a lot to it. It's a hydraulic system that puts pressure on the bolt and actually elongates the bolt and puts the joint together. It kind of squishes the joint together. It's not straightforward. I thought it was just a bunch of guys out there with wrenches tightening things down. It's not like that at all. It's much more complicated.
Oh yeah. No, definitely. Oh yeah.
So how often do you do that? How often should those tower bolts be checked?
So I'm not an engineer. Basically, in accordance with the engineering specifications, different manufacturers have different practices that they use, different timelines, and those are the bolts within the actual turbine. And then the foundations also generally have their own, tension check schedule that they go through. So it all depends on basically when the turbine's handed over to the owners get the maintenance schedule, and they'll have, it'll tell them, okay, this year do this, this operating year do this, and generally every year there's some sort of tension check that's being done.
Do then every OEM, all the OEMs have the same procedure, or do they have varying procedures? I can't imagine all the OEMs have their own special niche, right? And it seems like everybody's doing things slightly differently. Are they all tensioning bolts, or some of them torquing bolts? What, or is there some consistency between the OEMs?
So they're definitely not getting together and having a committee on how to do this. So definitely doing their own thing. Different manufacturers have their, some manufacturers they like to torque all of the bolts, and there's some benefits to that. The idea behind torquing, by the way, is you're trying to basically twist the nut in such a way that it creates a certain amount of tension within, the bolt. Okay, so at the end of the day, what you're trying to get is an accurate tension read. So you can either do that by stretching the bolt and then seating the nut, and that's called tensioning, or you can do it by torquing, which is where you're just taking the nut and twisting it until it reaches a certain torque value that then translates in an ideal world into a tension value. Obviously, like if you put grease between the nut and the flange, then obviously there's going to be a different tension value, or if there's dirt or there's not. So torquing isn't as accurate, but it's a lot easier to collect the data. The torque guns are usually electric, and they've got you go through and the electric gun tells you the torque data for every single bolt that you touch. The tensioners are not electric; they're hydraulic, and you just have you go through and you mark the ones that you tension, and you trust that the person who's got the machine in his hand is actually going through and tensioning each of the bolts that he touches.
So do the OEMs or do the owners, I would imagine, because it's such a critical piece here, do they require calibration of the tools and certification of the tools, and what's all involved there to make sure you get an accurate tension on a bolt?
Yes, the answer is yes. Every system that you use has to be calibrated, with different timelines based on what you're doing with it. Yeah, for torquing, you're basically going to send that in the manufacturer is going to, check the tool, make sure it's good, and then send it back to you. For tensioning, the whole system is kind of built off of the way it works is you pump hydraulic fluid in at a certain pressure, and that goes into what's called a head. And that head, based on the surface area of the hydraulic pressure, of the head, that pressure translates into a certain amount of tension, a certain amount of expansion force that turns into tension for the bolt. For that device, everything is basically measured by the pressure that's in the system. So the dial, the gauge, the pressure gauge, that's it. Sorry. There's my word. That's the one, that's the only component that gets sent in, and they check that to make sure that's good to go and then send it back.
So what's the procedure then when you're tensioning a bolt? I know, having gone through aircraft torquing school, when I worked in the aircraft industry, they taught us how to torque a bolt. And as an engineer, you're like, oh, okay, I kind of understand that. But in tensioning, which I've never done before, are you tensioning every bolt pretty much, or is it, especially for sites that have been around for a little while, are they doing a sampling? What's the steps there? So
the act of tensioning a bolt and the tension program are two different things. So I'll go over the act of tensioning a bolt. Basically, you put this. It looks like a number 10 can, with a hole in the middle of it. It's kind of what it looks like, and it's connected to a hydraulic hose. And you kind of put that over the bolt, and over the nut that's attached to the bolt. And then you screwed what's called a reaction device in, which is essentially just a nut that connects. That makes it to where that when this can expands, the reaction device grabs the bolt and pulls the bolt to a certain tension value. Okay, and so in order to make that tin can, the head is what it's called, expand, you hook it to a hydraulic hose. You pressurize the hose. The head expands. And then the reaction device grabs the bolt and pulls it to a specific tension value, and then you just make sure that that the bolt that was originally in place, the nut that was originally in place, is still seated. And some people are like, oh, if you grab that nut and you really crank on it, you're going to get some extra tension in the system, but that's not at all true. Because of the high amount of tension that you're pulling on that nut, no amount of hand cranking is going to make any difference as part of a percentage of the overall force that's being applied.
So basically, as you pull it, then if that nut's loose, if it's loose, like hand loose, you would tighten it. But if it's working properly, it should be pretty snug. Is that what happens?
Yeah, because you're not actually pulling it to 100% of its working value. So you pull it to 90% of the working value. And so so there should still be a lot of pressure on that nut. And so it shouldn't move at all. If there is pressure on that nut, then it's failed the test essentially. And so the way it's done programmatically is that you go through and you do a 10%, generally you do like a 10% sample on these base bolts. And if any of the nuts in that 10% fail, if any of the base bolts fail, then you do 100% retention. And that's where you're going to bring it up to 100% of its working value. And you're going to make sure that all of the nuts are seated.
It is a device that kind of grabs into the remaining threads of the bolt and pulls it, compresses the joint by pulling the bolt, which is amazing to think you could pull on that hard enough to make it move. But these tensioners are sort of massive devices. They are big hydraulic presses in a sense. So if you can pull it and it moves, and the nut moves, that'd be a little bit troubling, right? So at that point, if you're sampling and you sample 10% of them, and one of those or two of them, you can really twist the nut. Now you know you got an issue. So then you go back and you tension all the bolts around the ring. Is that what happens?
Yeah, 100% of them around the ring for that specific tower.
And so how many of those towers have you done end up needing 100% retensioning? 1%, 10%?
It depends on the age of the site, how often the site's been checked before, what are the conditions of the site as well. So, it could be from, 5 to 20% of them that fail. It happens. It's definitely something that happens, and it happens with enough frequency that this is a procedure that should be done And I think it's a well-justified procedure.
Yeah, because if the OEMs are calling it out, they realize that there's a lot of load there and they want to make sure nothing bad happens. So it makes sense to retension these bolts. So I'd imagine you're decently busy this summer because there's a lot of wind turbines in the Midwest, and you're located in Colorado. You're not very far from a lot of wind farms. How busy is your summer?
So we're actually currently on site at a 300 turbine site. After that, we've got 3 or 4 contracts that are in the works right now for tensioning. We also have, so tensioning, torque and tension is only one of or scheduled maintenance really, is only one of the departments that we've got. We also have blade repair, and we do construction management as well. And so for our blade repair, we've got another couple contracts that are in the works. But that being said, there's we've definitely not hit capacity for what we're capable of executing. So we're definitely looking for more work.
So, Will, how do people reach out to you and get a hold of Prometheus Wind?
So they can reach us at our website. It's prometheuswind.com, and that's spelled Prometheus, wind. Or you can send an email to our operations at operations. Our email address is operations@prometheuswind.com.
Well, hey, thanks, Will. I appreciate you having me on the program, and I look to have you back in the future.
Lightning is an act of God, but lightning damage is not. Actually, it's very predictable and very preventable. Strike Tape is a lightning protection system upgrade for wind turbines made by WeatherGuard. It dramatically improves the effectiveness of the factory LPS, so you can stop worrying about lightning damage. Visit weatherguardwind.com to learn more, read a case study, and schedule a call today.
So thanks to Will Friedl for being on the podcast. I hope to have Will back on in the near future. We're going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about Australian politics, since we have Rosemary here, even though she is currently located in the United States, basically the birthplace of democracy. Boston, Massachusetts. And so Australia had a bunch of elections, and we're trying to figure out like what the hell happened, because when you open the newspapers in America, there's like this massive shift in Australia, and all the greenies are now going to lead to this renewable future in Australia. But when I look at things in Australia, it's kind of like, ho hum, there's another election. So you want to explain what just happened in Australia?
Yeah, so I don't feel like it was ho hum. It's we had a government that was truly terrible for climate change, and they wrecked they just wrecked everything for the last more than 10 years, let's say 15 years. And so it's really good to see that gone. But everyone's reporting it like it was this climate election. But it's funny because the two major parties in Australia really didn't talk about climate much. And in fact, I feel like the government our current new government, the Labor Party, I feel like they really specifically went out of their way to not talk about it, because the last few elections that they've lost, they've had kind of like progressively less ambitious targets and policies, and they keep on getting smashed on it. And it's a really big contradiction, because several elections, at least maybe for a long way back, every poll, including the exit polls, show that people rank climate change as their number one concern in Australia, and then have just consistently voted for a government that is really, really trying hard to do nothing about it. So it's interesting. But the thing that happened with the election that was really unusual wasn't so much about the party that won, the Labor Party. It's the more progressive party. It was more about how badly the previous government, who they're called the Liberals, but that actually means conservative in Australia, so that's probably confusing for you. At one point, they were some sort of Liberal, but
confusing for me.
Everybody.
You Americans. Yeah. They're supposed to be economically liberal, but it's all very jumbled now. So they lost a ton of seats to independents. And the independents are people who are mostly conservative, except for that they care about climate change, that they care about women, not just women's rights, but women's equal participation in society, say. And then the third thing was integrity. That was the third issue that these groups of independents went on. And so I think that's a really big success story, because it's like, you know, I'm sure you're the same in America. In a lot of countries that have like a two-party dominant system, it feels like infuriating that you just have these, you know, like battles that just repeat between two terrible options, and there's no way to ever change that. But now we have like 10% or more of the seats in our House of Representatives taken by independents, and then the Greens Party picked up a lot too. And the reason why they were able to do that, I think, is largely because of the way that their Australian electoral system works. So I won't like give you a lecture on Australian democracy, but there's three big things that are different in Australia compared to the US, and I know Europe is totally different again. So Australia's system is more similar to the US. But first of all, Australia has compulsory voting, so everybody has to vote. We get more than 90% of people turn out and vote every single election. So that the effect of that is that you don't have to motivate people to go vote. It's not about the really, you know, the fringe ideas of people who are really passionate about some, you know, extreme position. They don't really play, or they don't have that much influence in the politics, because you need to convince most people, most ordinary people, not just people motivated enough to follow politics, but everybody will vote. So you need to convince them. Second thing is we don't have gerrymandering in Australia. The borders of the electorates, they're set by an independent commission. So you don't get any weird things where you get, where you get, you know, like maybe most of a state, maybe a state has, you know, mostly progressive voters, but the electorates are drawn so that they're all concentrated in a couple of seats and the rest is spread out. You don't have that in Australia, so I think that makes it a little bit more less extreme. But then the most significant thing is that we have preferential voting. So you don't just say, I want candidate X to win. You say, I like candidate X the best, and if they don't get in, then I want my vote to go for this person who I like second best, and then the third best, the fourth best, fifth best. So it means you can vote for an independent or someone that has no chance of winning, and if they get the fewest votes, then they'll take your vote and put it in a different pile, the pile that you put number 2.
So for Rosemary, what does this mean for Australia and renewable projects like the Star of the South and a couple of the offshore wind projects? Are they going to get ramped up, or is it just less impediments in front of them now?
So the Labor Party, the Progressive Party, they have a majority in the House of Reps, so they can, you know, set the direction on their own. They don't need to form a coalition with anybody or convince any of these independents to vote with them. In the Senate, it's different. In the Senate, the Greens Party will have the balance of power, so they will have to negotiate there to get things through the Senate. So the actual result is not that different to what we've had before. And I mean, anybody listening from Europe will know that, you know, these coalition governments are the norm in most countries over there. And we've had them in Australia before too, and it works quite nicely to actually have to negotiate with other people to, you know, get your positions through, because it makes them more, you know, probably more broadly satisfactory. So it's not a big difference. But one thing about the Labor parties, I quite liked their platform actually for climate change, because one, it was a platform that allowed them to get elected, whereas, you know, if they had adopted more extreme or, you know, better climate policies, I don't think that they would have got elected. So we would have kept our terrible government. And the other thing is that they're not focusing as much on targets, announcing policies and, you know, nice sounding things. All of their policies are all to do with, okay, we need more transmission. We need to make it, you know, easier to connect to the grid. We need more storage, you know, distributed storage, things like that. And from my opinion, that's the actual things that we need to do to speed up the energy transition, is get rid of some of these roadblocks to installing more renewables. So I think that we are going to see a lot of action, but it's not going to come in the form of like huge targets that are going to make, climate activists happy. But
Sure.
Climate engineers like me, we're happy.
This is going to be an interesting rollout. I guess we'll have to keep an eye on it over the next year or two, because if they're really serious about basically removing regulation is what you're talking about, then they're going to have to get on it pretty quickly, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Interesting. Thanks, Rosemary, for that. That's good to catch up on that. So everybody's been following the ESG discussion in the United States, and Elon Musk really dropping a bomb on it in the last week or so. So let's just kind of step back a minute and talk about what ESG is. So major stock indexes actually track different companies based on their ESG index. And the Standard & Poor's has an ESG index. And what is ESG? It's environmental, social, and governance. So there's like 3 areas that you can basically put numbers against. And so what happens is these rating companies like S&P go back and look to see what a company has done in the environmental arena, the social arena, and on governance, and then stick a number on top of that. Well, when they did that, ExxonMobil did great, and Tesla got booted out of the ranking altogether. They got taken out of that index fund. And Elon Musk is like, what the hell's going on, right? Tesla CEO Elon Musk called the ratings a scam, quote unquote, a scam. And the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission proposed new disclosure rules for funds that market themselves as ESG focused. So basically they're saying, hey, are you guys cooking the books? And if so, you need to open the books so everybody can see how you're creating these ranking systems. So kind of how this goes is Tesla probably does rate very high on a lot of environmental factors, but there's some discussions about their social and governance that some analysts are not super happy with. The S&P listed some racial discrimination lawsuits with Tesla, some poor working conditions at a factory that I have been to out in California as part of the reason why they fell down and ExxonMobil got ranked near the top. So I guess that leads to the question of there's a lot of discussion about ESG, and do we use it? And is it useful, or is it just, as Rosemary puts it, greenwashing of companies to put a nice little label on ExxonMobil and some of the oil companies? The floor is open, because I don't know if there's a good answer.
I dug into some of the ESG statements that you see online, and what you start to find when you go industry by industry, silo by silo, depending on who you're talking about, an oil company, you're talking about a software company. It's never apples to apples. And I know, like you said, like Standard & Poor, they have their check boxes and there are these things, but when you look at say ExxonMobil versus Tesla, because this is what the article that we're talking about here is, it doesn't take into consideration any of the after effects of the products when they're used, right? So ExxonMobil gets almost like they get a pat on the back, and Tesla doesn't, because they don't create emissions when the vehicles are running, or when they're putting fuel into things of that sort, right? So the after effects of what their products aren't taken into consideration. So you're not talking apples to apples there, right? And it's kind of the to me it seems like when people start talking about carbon credits and carbon indexes, it's almost not regulated in a certain way. There isn't an actual legitimate market sitting there. So it's hard to measure.
The people that I know that work, within this space and, help with some aspects of these ratings pretty consistently think that it's a joke. The ESG ratings, rankings. And I think it's partly because what they're trying to do, you've got the 3 things: environment, social, governance. Usually people actually mean when they talk about these things, and that's why everyone's outraged about Tesla, right? I think people know that Tesla has all these problems related to its workforce, and the cases that you mentioned, Alan, about racial discrimination and that sort of thing. So
are they any different than ExxonMobil?
I don't
really. Tesla? You think Tesla is any different than any
I've
other
actually
U.S.
got
corporation?
the impression I've
Really?
never been tempted to pursue a career at Tesla because it sounds like a horrible place to work to me. So I think
You're getting worked hard, sure. I don't doubt
and
that.
it sounds like a
but
bit
is
of a
it
lack
like
of
any different than any other place?
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have got bad impressions from it of it from what I've read, but I've never considered working for an oil and gas company, so I couldn't tell you if you know, if that's better or worse. And I know in the Australian mining industry, there's been a huge case where people have suddenly discovered that it's a terrible place for a woman to work on a remote mine in Australia. It probably is fairly widespread. I don't think it's easy for minorities most places. But to what extent does it make sense that you lump all that in together? I mean, if you care about the environment, then, you know, should there just be climate friendly companies, and should there be, if you care about diversity, should, you know, there maybe be a diversity index instead? Maybe. I think it's kind of conflating a lot of things together.
Yeah, right. I think you're right about that. From working in America for a long time and walking the streets and being in a lot of places, Americans are pretty knowledgeable about what's going on. It isn't like these are all hidden. If people know what's happening inside General Motors or Ford or any large corporation where you got thousands of employees. There's going to be a variety of nonsense things that are going on, and it's just a conglomeration of a bunch of humans put together. So there's going to be noise inside of there for sure. But are they really different? Do you think that the CEO of Ford is better or worse than the CEO of Tesla in terms of handling governance? I probably don't see a lot of difference there. I don't see a lot of difference between a lot of these companies. I think what it comes down to is, do you like the products that they make or not? If I don't like oil, then sure, then you're going to derate ExxonMobil. But do I need an ESG rating to know that? Like,
well, the
what purpose
ESG
does it
rating
serve?
wouldn't tell you that anyway, because they rank companies within sectors and they don't include scope 3 emissions. So, you know, like Joel was saying, Tesla doesn't get the benefit of selling cars that don't emit CO2, and ExxonMobil doesn't pay a penalty for selling their product that they know that their customers are going to burn it, right? It's not a secret. So
a lot of it seems.
I think the other important aspect is that it depends what you can measure as well. Like, how do you measure the diversity the S&G parts are so much more fuzzy to measure, whereas the E part, there's a lot of metrics you can actually do. And so I would personally separate them out. Yeah,
I think it's hard on the social side. I think you have a hard time. And if left up to people's, it's just like you talked about, Rosemary. You wouldn't choose to work at Tesla. Okay. Well, a lot of people choose not to work at a lot of places. It doesn't mean there is inherent limitations that are being placed on employment there. It just means people are free to choose, and that's fine. If the opposite were true, and there were restrictions, then I think a lot of people be blowing the whistle about it and saying, well, this isn't right. And rightly so. They should do that. But in this Google world, where I can instantaneously see every lawsuit that's brought to every company instantaneously, I can see what the emissions are pretty quickly on what a company does. I just don't see this need for ESG, and I think that's why Elon Musk is calling it a scam, because it is like cooking the books a little bit, right? I think in the United States, we went through all the housing debacle and the collapse of Lehman Brothers and all this stuff. That was sort of based on Standard & Poor's and some other ranking companies. The ratings, they were giving ratings that were just complete BS. And I feel like, well, are we just back to 2007 and 8 again? Where we're creating these ratings, which maybe have some implication on the performance of a company, and they really don't. So what's the point of them? And should the U.S. government, which it seems to be getting involved in this, is the U.S. government going to put their stamp on it? Because that was the problem in the 2007 and 8, which is the U.S. government via Fannie and Freddie put their stamp on this kind of stuff and let it go on and didn't really audit the process. And now we went through years of turmoil, 2-3 solid years of turmoil. And I kind of feel like ESG is going down the same pathway. Joel, am I too far off the
I think what we see in ESG right now is while those things are all good, we're trying to move towards them, right? We're trying to solve climate issues. We're trying to solve some of these social issues. You're seeing all these things come up, and companies are making moves towards this. But it almost seems like that ESG metric or index is the trendy thing right now that you see for, of course, in the investing world. But like Rosemary says, the term greenwashing is perfect, and it's very common now too. You'll see. I know of actually a group out of Houston that bought an algae plant to do biofuels, well knowing that they were going to lose their pants on it when they bought it. But it was to be able to market it to say we're doing something good for the environment. So it's so hard to see behind shadows and behind what's real, what's not, and like is it metric, what's intrinsic. Some of it is on feeling. I'm sure some of these people just don't like Elon Musk, and that's how he might have got a check mark here and there. But I don't know if it's something that we want to base our economy on. Is a rating that one group says of another. He said, she said.
Right. Do I want not to invest in Tesla? I would say I want to invest in Tesla because they're doing good things.
Exactly.
And if the federal government steps in and says their ESG rating's not high enough, we want you to delist them. We want you to take them off the stock indexes.
You're messing with.
Which in theory,
you're messing with capitalism.
As crazy as it seems, you're messing with capitalism, and that's not a smart thing to do in America. That gets you thrown out of office pretty quickly.
That gets your inflation.
It's an interesting piece that's going on.
That gets inflation to 8.5%.
Yeah, I think it's right. Exactly. And Rosemary, you should trademark greenwashing. I think that's your word, actually, isn't it?
It's
I
not
feel like
my
I should
word.
put TM after that.
No. That's a very normal word. But I'm pleased that you think that I came up with it.
Just get yourself a stamp and stamp it. Greenwashing.
Maybe I see it more places than most people.
So that's going to do it for this week on the Uptime Wind Energy podcast. Stay tuned next week. We have another interesting guest. I'm not going to announce it now, but you will enjoy it. And keep listening. We have a lot of subscribers actually on Spotify, so we really appreciate all the Spotify users. Apple podcast, a lot of serious users on that platform too. Check us out on YouTube, and do not miss Engineering with Rosie, because she has a lot of great programming. I just watched the recent video, Rosemary. It was excellent. So stay tuned. We'll see you next week on the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast.